All right, welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive.
You guys know how much we love digging into these fascinating corners of like science and health and stuff.
Absolutely.
And today, get this, we're going to be taking a look at autism and respiratory health.
Okay.
Specifically, you sent over some research about a possible link between autism and conditions like bronchitis and bronchiectasis.
Right.
And I got to say, some of this stuff really surprised me.
Yeah.
So to help us unpack all of this is, well, our incredible expert who can break down even the most complex topics.
Happy to be here. So where are we starting?
Well, since we're talking about some potentially unfamiliar territory here,
Yeah.
maybe we could start by just like defining our terms.
Okay.
Bronchiectasis, those aren't exactly like household names.
Yeah, good point. So bronchitis, you can almost picture it, right? It's all about inflammation.
Okay.
We're talking about those tubes, the airways that carry air to your lungs getting inflamed.
Like a bad cold that kind of settles in your chest.
Exactly. Now, that's the kind we'd call acute bronchitis, often caused by a virus.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's chronic bronchitis, which sticks around longer and can be related to things like smoking or air pollution.
Okay, so that's bronchitis in a nutshell.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's this other term you sent us, bronchiectasis.
Yes.
That one sounds a bit more intense, like something you'd whisper in a doctor's office.
Yeah, it can be pretty serious.
Yeah.
Imagine this. Bronchiectasis is like bronchitis' tougher, more persistent, older sibling.
Oh, boy.
It's a complication that can develop from repeated bouts of bronchitis or other lung infections.
So it's not just a one-time thing. It's like your body's waging a war against these recurring infections.
That's a great way to put it. Basically, those bronchial tubes, the airways we talked about, get damaged and widened over time.
Cook.
This makes it really hard for your lungs to clear out mucus, which, as you can imagine, isn't good.
No, this sounds like a recipe for trouble.
Unfortunately, it can be. That built-up mucus becomes a breeding ground for bacteria, creating this vicious cycle of infections. And it can be especially dangerous for people who already have other health conditions that make it harder to fight off those infections in the first place.
Okay, so now we're starting to see why this topic might be particularly relevant for anyone touched by autism, right?
Exactly. And this is where your research really piqued our interest. Because it turns out respiratory issues, including these more serious conditions we've been talking about, are surprisingly common in autistic individuals.
Yeah, you mentioned you were researching this connection, and the numbers we found were honestly kind of startling.
Yeah.
It seems like respiratory issues aren't just a little more common in autistic individuals, they're significantly more prevalent.
Right.
Like, did you know that about 25% of children with ASD have asthma?
It's a lot.
That's 1 in 4.
Yeah, it's a striking statistic, and it really underscores this possible connection between autism and respiratory health that we're kind of exploring here.
Yeah.
And it's not just asthma. Research indicates that almost half of all children with ASD experience some form of respiratory distress. Wow.
Whether it's wheezing, persistent coughing, or something more serious.
Okay, so that right there tells us there's something more going on here. It's not just a coincidence.
Right.
But the million-dollar question is, why?
Yeah.
Why are these respiratory issues so much more common in autistic individuals? What's the link?
Well, the research you sent over points to a few potential factors, and some of them are pretty surprising. One of the things that really jumped out at us was this idea of lung anatomy itself potentially playing a role.
Really?
We found a study in respiratory medicine that suggests there might actually be subtle differences in lung structure in some autistic individuals.
Wait, so we're talking about physical differences in the lungs themselves, like maybe the size of the airways or something?
Exactly. There's emerging evidence suggesting that variations in airway size and overall lung capacity could be more common in autistic individuals. And you can see how that could make a difference. Totally. If the very structure of the lungs is different, it makes sense that it could affect how effectively they can clear out mucus and fight off those infections we were talking about earlier.
Precisely. And this ties in with another key factor, sensory sensitivities.
Right.
As you know, sensory sensitivities are a big part of autism, with many people on the spectrum experiencing heightened sensitivity to things like dust pollen, strong smells, even just changes in temperature.
Right. And usually when we talk about sensory sensitivities, we're thinking about it in terms of discomfort or even sensory overload.
Sure.
But are you saying that these sensitivities could actually have physical repercussions when it comes to respiratory health?
Absolutely. Think about it if you're constantly bombarded by things that irritate your airways, dust, pollen, smoke. It stands to reason that it's going to lead to more inflammation, more coughing, and potentially make you more vulnerable to infections. It's like your body is in a perpetual state of fight or flight against these sensory triggers, and that takes a toll.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like how some people with allergies are more prone to developing asthma. Their airways are just on high alert all the time.
Exactly. And this is where it gets even more interesting because on top of these physiological and sensory factors, we also have to consider the role of behavioral factors. And this is something that folks who live with autism or care for someone who does might find especially relevant.
Okay, so this is where things might feel a little more personal, a little closer to home.
Right.
We're talking about things like exercise and physical activity levels, right? Because I know from the research you sent that this can be a sensitive area for some.
It is a sensitive topic, but it's an important piece of the puzzle when we're talking about respiratory health. And I want to emphasize, it's not about placing blame or making anyone feel bad about their activity levels. It's about promoting understanding and empowering people with knowledge.
Well said.
Yeah.
So what's the connection between physical activity and respiratory health in this context?
Well, we know that in general, regular physical activity is important for maintaining good lung capacity and overall respiratory health. But for some individuals on the autism spectrum, engaging in physical activity can be challenging for various reasons. Motor skills differences, sensory sensitivities, or difficulty with coordination.
Yeah.
And those challenges can sometimes lead to lower levels of physical activity overall, which can unfortunately make the respiratory system more susceptible to illness.
It's like the old saying, if you don't use it, you lose it.
Right.
And in this case, it is that vital lung capacity that helps us fight off infections.
Exactly. And then, as if all of that weren't enough, we also have to factor in the role of other co-occurring conditions. We've talked about asthma, but allergies in general are more common in autistic individuals. And just like with the sensory sensitivities we discussed, those allergies can exacerbate respiratory problems.
Wow, so it's like this perfect storm of factors. Things related to lung structure, sensory experiences, physical activity levels, and other health conditions.
It's complex.
It's complicated.
And that's precisely why it's so important for anyone caring for or working with autistic individuals to be aware of this connection and take steps to minimize risks and promote good respiratory health.
That's such a crucial point. We've done all this unpacking of the why, but now I'm wondering, what can listeners actually do with this information? How do we shift from understanding to action?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And this is where knowledge really becomes power, because once we're armed with this understanding, we can advocate for better care, make informed decisions, and support the well-being of ourselves and those around us. And that all starts with awareness, simply acknowledging that this connection exists.
So for our listener who's really tuned into this conversation, maybe they're a parent, an educator, or even an autistic individual themselves, what are some of the most important takeaways when it comes to protecting and supporting respiratory health?
Well, I think a great place to start is with regular health checkups. This is always important, but it's especially crucial in this context. Early detection and treatment of any respiratory issues can truly make all the difference.
Absolutely. Catching things early on could prevent those more serious complications we talked about earlier, like that nasty bronchiectasis.
Exactly. And then there are things we can do within our own environments to create a healthier space. Remember those sensory sensitivities we talked about? Minimizing exposure to irritants like dust, smoke, strong perfumes. Those small changes can make a big difference.
You know, as you were saying that, I was thinking about the air filters in my house.
Right?
It's amazing how these little things can slip our minds.
Yeah.
Okay, so regular checkups, a clean environment. What else?
Education and awareness. The more caregivers, family members, educators, and individuals themselves understand about these potential connections, the better equipped everyone will be to provide support and advocate for appropriate care. It's about being proactive, asking the right questions, and connecting the dots, just like we're doing right now.
I love that. Connecting the dots. It's like we're all detectives in a way, looking for clues and piecing together the bigger picture of health and well-being.
And that brings me to another important piece of the puzzle, one that we touched on briefly earlier, physical activity. Now, I know we talked about how engaging in physical activity can be challenging for some individuals on the spectrum, but even gentle, enjoyable movement can work wonders for strengthening those lungs.
So it doesn't have to be about training for a marathon or anything intense like that. It's more about finding activities that are accessible and, most importantly, enjoyable.
Precisely. It could be dancing, swimming, yoga, even just going for a walk in nature, whatever sparks joy and gets the body moving. Even small steps can make a difference.
It's like finding that sweet spot where movement feels good for both the body and the mind.
Which, let's be honest, is a win-win for everyone.
Absolutely.
So we've covered a lot of ground here.
Yeah.
We talked about how surprisingly common respiratory issues are for individuals with autism.
Right.
And we've explored some of the potential whys behind this connection.
Yeah. And we've talked about some of the things that we can do.
Right.
I think one of the most powerful takeaways from all of this is that knowledge really is power in this situation. Just knowing that this connection between autism and respiratory health exists is a huge first step.
Yeah.
It allows us to be more informed, more proactive, and more empowered to advocate for ourselves or for the people in our lives.
100%. It's about connecting those dots and understanding that, hey, maybe these things aren't completely unrelated after all.
Right.
And that awareness can make all the difference in the world. I'm thinking back to that statistic about 25% of children with ASD having asthma.
Yeah.
Before we start this deep dive, that number would have shocked me. But now it makes a lot more sense when you understand all these underlying factors we've been talking about.
Right.
The lung structure, the sensory sensitivities, the challenges with exercise. It's all connected.
It is.
Yeah.
And, it makes you wonder, what other health connections might we be overlooking?
Right.
What other aspects of autism and well-being could be intertwined in ways we haven't even considered yet?
That's such a good point. It's like opening a door to a whole new way of thinking about health and the human body.
Exactly. And it highlights the importance of research awareness and ongoing conversations like this one.
Yeah.
Because the more we know, the better equipped we are to support not just physical health, but overall well-being for everyone.
Couldn't agree more. Well, I don't know about you, but I feel like this deep dive has given me a lot to think about.
Me too.
Yeah.
It's been a fascinating exploration.
And for our listeners out there, based on what you shared with us, this particular deep dive feels especially relevant. It really highlights how much more there is to learn about autism and all of its complexities.
Absolutely. And it underscores how important it is to approach health and well-being from a holistic perspective.
Right.
We can't just focus on one aspect of a person's health in isolation.
Yeah.
Everything is connected.
As we've been talking, I've been thinking about how empowering it can be to have this kind of knowledge, because when you understand these connections, you can start to advocate for yourself or your loved ones in a more informed way.
Yeah.
You can ask your doctor the right questions. You can make changes in your environment. You can even start to think differently about physical activity and what it can look like. It's about taking control of your health journey.
I love that. Taking control of your health journey. And it's not just about individual empowerment. It's about shifting the conversation around autism and health in a more inclusive and informed direction.
100%. It's about moving beyond assumptions and really listening to what the research and the lived experiences of autistic individuals are telling us. And it seems like there's still so much more to discover.
There is. And that's what makes this whole field so fascinating.
Right.
Every new piece of research, every conversation like this one opens up new doors and new possibilities.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive.
Right?
But before we do, I have to ask, what's one thing you hope our listener will take away from this conversation?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
I think if there's one thing I hope our listener remembers, it's this. When it comes to autism and health, there are always more connections to be made, more to understand, and more ways to support well-being.
I love that. More to discover, more to understand, more to support. So to our listener out there, we hope this deep dive has given you plenty to ponder as you continue on your own health journey. And remember, knowledge is power. Until next time, keep exploring.